Rome was not born ready. It was sculpted with the iron of the sword, shaped by the blows of the shield, and elevated by men who did not see the world as it was, but as it could be under their banners. Its rise did not begin in golden palaces, but in the battlefields, on the dusty trails where soldiers marched hungry for glory and generals determined to conquer not just lands, but time itself. It is impossible to speak of the Roman Empire without diving into its backbone, military power. More than emperors and senators, it was the strategists, the masters of war, who pushed the boundaries of Rome ever further. Facing deserts, mountains, jungles, and unknown seas, with only one certainty, victory was the only acceptable fate. And it all began with men like Domitius Lirianus, a commander who carried not only spears in his convoys but a mind years ahead of his time. Rome was still a hesitant republic, surrounded by enemies and fears, when Lirianus led his legions to the heart of the peninsula and then across the sea, facing tribes that seemed unbeatable. His greatest feat was not just to win, but to convince. He transformed peasants and merchants into devoted soldiers, stitching Rome together with discipline and loyalty. The story you are about to hear is not just about battles, but about decisions made in campaign tents by torchlight, about maps drawn with blood, about ambition, honor, and betrayal. The 10 men we will see next did not just command armies, they shaped the Western world. We have changed their names, but the conquests, the dramas, the sacrifices, and the deeds remain alive. As if they still echo through the marble and sand corridors of Rome's eternal legions. While Domizio Liriano was planting the roots of Roman discipline, another name began to stand out in the eastern fringes of Rome's borders, Tito Vercinio, a strategist who viewed each battle as a work of art. Unlike traditional generals, who relied on the brute force of legions, Vercinio was driven by something more subtle, the understanding of the enemy's mind. For him, winning meant anticipating, not just the opponent's movements, but their fears, their culture, their way of thinking. It was in the distant campaigns against the peoples of the steppes, where the cold was as cruel as the enemy blades, that Vercinio became a legend. He not only defeated numerically superior armies but did so without shedding more blood than necessary. He used theatrical ambushes, feigned retreats, built false roads, and made it seem as if the gods were guiding his path. In one of these campaigns, he faced the most cunning rival commander from the east, who had humiliated 3 Roman generals before him. But Vercinio studied his enemy as one reads a poem. He learned their habits, their pride, their limits, and with a silent siege of 12 nights, without a single shout, he conquered what seemed invincible. The fame of Tito Vercinio grew to the point where senators feared his influence more than that of any consul. But he never desired political power. He preferred the anonymity of maps folded over stones, whispered conversations with his centurions. Plans sketched in charcoal on leather. And it was thus that Rome not only expanded its territory but also its own way of waging war. He taught the Romans that winning a war was more than killing, it was controlling the narrative of victory. At the dawn of the civil wars, when Rome itself began to crumble under the weight of its ambition, a general emerged whose presence was more feared among the Romans than among the barbarians, Cassius Albicinius. A cold, calculating man, with eyes that seemed to decipher intentions before they were even spoken. Albicinius was the type of commander who sought not applause, but results. And it was precisely this detachment from prestige that transformed him into one of the most efficient and controversial masters of war in ancient Rome. Cassius Albicinius did not fight for Rome, but for order. When the legions began to divide between personal loyalties and political promises, he chose the most unlikely cause, balance. He was the only one who saw that the destruction of the Senate or the dominance of a single man represented no victory at all, only the end of the republican ideal. And that is why he marched against childhood allies, besieged cities he himself had helped to build, and ultimately faced one of the bloodiest campaigns of the conflict, the Battle of the Sartian Valley, where he commanded 3 exhausted legions against a rebel force nearly twice as large. But Albicinius was not just a logistical genius or a brilliant tactician. He reinvented the use of the landscape. He used the sound of the wind, the reflections of the sunset, and even the position of corpses on the field to manipulate the enemy's perception. When he finally won at the Sartian Valley, he did not celebrate. He simply dismounted his horse, walked among the bodies, and whispered, "It is not victory that honors me. It is what it prevented." Even today, historians debate whether Cassius Albicinius was a hero or a traitor. But one thing is certain, his ability to command without ever being corrupted by glory made him one of the most complex and fascinating generals in Roman history. There was a time when the borders of Rome seemed unattainable. But it was only when the name of Lucius Salvian echoed in the deserts of the east that the empire realized that conquering lands was much easier than keeping them. Salvian was not a general like the others. Born in a forgotten coastal village in Sicily, he learned from a young age that silence was worth more than bravado. Unlike his peers who dreamed of triumphal arches and marble statues, Lucius dreamed of maps and silence. The peak of his career came during the campaign in Syria, when the eastern tribes, tired of Roman promises and encouraged by treacherous client kings, began a series of brutal uprisings. Rome sent Salvian to restore order. But he did more than that. Instead of simply crushing the revolts with brute force, he infiltrated the very cultural fabric of the local peoples. He learned their languages, understood their gods, made unlikely alliances with priests, caravan leaders, and even desert thieves. Over time, the rebellion ceased not out of fear, but out of respect. The cities that once spat on the Roman standard now hoisted it with pride. Not out of submission, but because Lucius Salvian had made Rome seem like theirs too. His greatest achievement, however, was not military. It was political. Using a series of silent agreements, he redesigned the entire structure of Roman control in the region without shedding a single drop of blood after the initial pacification. Historians call this period the Pax Salviana, 23 years of absolute stability in one of the most volatile regions of the empire. And when he returned to Rome, he asked for neither gold nor a parade. Just an audience with the Senate, where he left a scroll with 4 words, "Victory without noise endures." After that, he disappeared. Some say he returned to the desert. Others swear he lived as a monk in the mountains of Cappadocia. But everyone agrees on one thing: there has never been a general like Lucius Salvian. When the legions were on the brink of collapse and the Roman standards were seen more as targets than symbols of power, Caius Dravicus emerged, a strategist with eyes as cold as marble and a mind that saw patterns where others saw only chaos. His name did not come from noble lineage, but from a line of merchants who learned to survive among debts and empty promises. Perhaps that is why his vision of war was never about glory, it was about balance, like a scale about to tip into the abyss. It was during the Balkan Wars, when Rome faced an unstable alliance of mountain tribes and Thracian mercenaries, that Dravicus proved to be a genius beyond any military manual. While other generals confined themselves to known routes and standard formations, he used the very terrain as a weapon. Once, upon learning that his troops were cornered in a narrow valley, he ordered them to dig channels and release a dammed lake in the mountains. The flood devastated the enemy camps and drowned thousands without a single Roman gladius being unsheathed. But his genius was not limited to the force of nature. Dravicus was a master at manipulating information. He spread rumors among the enemies about fictitious desertions, created false intercepted notes on purpose, and made opposing generals turn against each other without realizing they were dancing to his tune. Thus, his campaigns had an unusual characteristic: enemies surrendered before the battle. When his standards appeared in the distance, it was as if war itself gave up on continuing. Many said that Dravicus was invincible because no one knew exactly where he was, or what he knew. In the Senate, he gained the reputation of a sorcerer. But the people of the legions called him the Dark One, not out of fear, but because they knew that wherever he passed, war faded away like a shadow in the sun, silent, inevitable, and total. During a time when the empire seemed to bleed from all its borders, Lucilius Vetrovius emerged, a commander whose coldness would become legendary, and whose victories would seal one of the most violent and decisive chapters of Rome, the pacification of the East. Vitruvius was not a traditional warrior. Few saw him fight. He was short, with a reserved manner, sunken eyes, and an almost submissive posture. But behind that modest appearance was a mind that functioned like a network of gears lubricated with blood, calculation, and patience. When sent to quell the rebellion of the eastern provinces, a mosaic of client kingdoms, treacherous factions, and caravans financing militias, he knew he could not win with brute force. Rome had already tried. And failed. Vitruvius's strategy was more subtle. He did not want to destroy, he wanted to suffocate. He began by cutting off the trade routes that sustained the rebels. Then, he infiltrated men disguised as merchants and pilgrims, who spread diseases among the enemy camps. Fevers and plagues decimated entire armies even before the first clash. Finally, he divided the tribal leaders by promising titles, gold, and the right to keep their lands, and while they argued among themselves, their cities were silently surrounded by legions hidden in the mountains. The decisive battle at Nadia never really happened. The enemies, weakened, surrendered en masse after 3 weeks of psychological siege. Without a single catapult launched, Vitruvius reconquered the entire region, and his soldiers entered the cities without resistance. The Senate honored him, of course. But he refused the triumphal parade. He preferred anonymity. He said that overly celebrated generals created more enemies than victories. And he disappeared from the military map shortly after, taking up a lowly position at a customs port in Hispania. Vitruvius became a myth, a spectre cited in military academies and whispered in political corridors. Not for his violence, but for proving that the most efficient war is the one won before it begins. In the twilight of the empire, as the Roman sun slowly set behind the mountains of history, a name shone with the strength of a star in agony: Cassius Balbinius. The last general to believe that Rome could still be reborn, not by the hands of corrupt senators, but by the edge of a sword wielded with honor. Balbinius was born in a turbulent time, when Rome was no longer its own master. Barbarians at the borders, traitors in the palace, and generals selling their loyalties as if they were dusty cloaks in a market in Anche. But he was not like the others. Raised in the devastated fields of Gaul, the son of a healer and a renegade centurion, Balbinius learned early that the name Rome only held value when defended by those who pronounced it with chests puffed out in glory, not with pockets full of foreign coins. His chance came when the Danube was crossed by a horde of united tribes, something Rome had never seen before: Getae, Sarmatians, and Goths marching as one body towards the capital. No one believed it was possible to stop them. The emperor was already negotiating the surrender of entire territories in exchange for peace. But Balbinius, with an improvised and poorly equipped army, set out against the inevitable. And it was there, at the Battle of Tarsagora, that he left his eternal mark. Not for the victory, which came, bloody and costly, but for the way he united Roman legionaries and peasants, deserters, and even former slaves. He did not lead soldiers, he led Romans, in the purest sense of the word. With cries of "Rome does not surrender," his troops faced a force 3 times larger and, in maneuvers that bordered on madness, surrounded the invaders using the very geography, hills, forests, forgotten trails, as weapons. When the barbarian chiefs were captured and humiliated before their tribes, Balbinius set them free, saying, "Today we do not defeat you. We defeat the end of what we are." He returned to Rome as a hero but refused any title. He was last seen boarding alone for the African coast, where, it is said, he lived as a fisherman and storyteller for children. Perhaps he understood before anyone else that Rome, as an empire, was doomed to collapse. But as a symbol, it would never die. And that is what Balbinius defended, not the marble stones, but the invisible soul of an entire world. And if all that you have seen so far has managed to captivate you from beginning to end, imagine what is to come in the next videos. Here, each story is more than a fact of the past, it is a visceral dive into the world where swords decided the fate of empires. So, if you felt a chill with the war strategies, if you visualized marching with those legions, or simply want to continue exploring the darker and more glorious side of Rome's history, this channel is your home. Click like right now. Besides helping the content reach more people, it's your way of saying, I want more stories like this. And if you're not subscribed yet, subscribe now, because the next generals, battles, and twists coming up will completely change the way you see the past. Activate the bell, because history, here, never sleeps. It bleeds, marches, and is reborn. See you in the next episode, soldier.